Namaste and welcome to the third iteration of our summary presentation on Patanjali Yoga Sutra Samadhipad. Today we'll be looking at Sutras 41 to 51, beginning with the concept of samapatti and ending in Nirbija Samadhi. So it's appropriate that the Samadhipad, the first presentation of the Patanjali Yoga Darshan, would end with a discussion of samadhi on the subtle level. Patanjali Rishi, as the other ancient rishis, presents the sutras in a cyclical fashion. In the first two sutras, samadhi was implied both in the invocation of the eternal present moment in Sutra 1, Atha Yoga Nushasanam, and again in Sutra 2, in the expression of Nirodha being both the process and the final resolution of all thought waves through the statement, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is this restraint, the calming, the control of the thought waves in the mind. So here, Patanjali is again expressing the truth of samadhi, which was presented in a more explicit form in Sutra 17, where samadhi was presented in terms of the subtle thought processes going on in the stages of deep concentration, being vitarka, with reasoning, with ideation and words accompanying, vichara, deep internal reflection on the essence of the energetic object of concentration, ananda, or bliss, the bliss of absorption in the pure indwelling beingness, and sasmita, asmita samadhi, the samadhi of absorption in I-sense itself. So these are deep and internal stages of concentration, meditation, and samadhi. So naturally, samadhi being beyond words and concepts, being subtle, and being a deep inner experience, it might be appropriate to look at it from different points of view, from different angles, and thus Patanjali both presents the idea of samadhi, describes it in terms of the subtle mental processes, and now will describe the samadhi in terms of the objects on which the mind is resting in the different stages of concentration. These objects progress from an object that's perceived through the senses to a subtle object or energetic presence, and to the stage where the subject itself becomes the object of concentration, the subject being our indwelling self. So this will be explained in the course of these sutras, and in foreshadowing, there is still another explanation of samadhi which will be taken up in Vibhutipad, as Vibhutipad, the third iteration of Patanjali Yoga Sutra, begins with the internal limbs of yoga, dharana, dhyan, and samadhi. There again, samadhi will be presented from a different point of view, the point of view of a transformation of consciousness. So again, in today's summary, we'll be looking at samadhi in terms of the objects on which the mind is absorbed, or samapatti, the objects of samapatti.
In today's group of sutras, there are some of the keystone sutras. Those are 41, 43, and 46, 48, and 51. We'll now begin by chanting Sutra 41.
China vrittir abhijata shaiva maner grahitri grahana graheshu tat stat tadanjanata samapatti.
When the fluctuations of the mind are weakened, the mind becomes like a transparent crystal and appears to take on the form of the object of meditation, whether it be the cognizer, the instruments of cognition, or the object cognized. This is called samapatti. So this sutra offers this beautiful image of the mind becoming like the transparent crystal and taking on the form of the object of meditation. And this is a kind of transformation. We're quite familiar when our mind takes on the form of our emotion and our thoughts. And this sutra says that when the thoughts, the vritti, the revolutions and fluctuations of our mind are calm, the mind becomes like a transparent crystal. It also says pure-born, clear. And in that clarity, it takes on the sacred object, becomes the same as, takes on the form of the sacred object of concentration. And in that absorption, there is samapatti. The samadhi is realized. This is a very practical sutra, giving the result of practice and giving the method of practice. The fluctuations of the mind are controlled. That's the method. The mind becomes like a transparent crystal. That's the result. It goes on to talk about the object because, as Dayanand said, this samapatti is explained in terms of the object of concentration. And so the sutra says the object may be the cognizer, the instruments of cognition, or the object cognized, and regardless, the mind will take on its form. And this is samapatti. So Dayanand will speak more about the cognizer, the instruments of cognition, or the object cognized.
The levels of samapatti are exactly parallel to the levels of samadhi that were presented in Sutra 17. So there shouldn't be any confusion because of the change of the word from samadhi to samapatti. The word samapatti is translated as engrossment. So the mind becomes absorbed in the object of concentration, such that there is no wandering of the mind to different times or places or desires or imaginations or memories. The mind remains fixed in the calm absorption into the essence of the object in which it is concentrated. Patanjali presents it first as grahitri, or subjective, grahana, then secondly is the instruments of cognition, and grahya, or the objects of cognition. We are going to take it for the purposes of explanation in the opposite of order, because Patanjali always starts with the highest, but we need to start from where we are, and we're in the dualistic sense of perceiving objects as if they were external to our mind and independent of us. That's not the reality that's revealed through the process of samadhi, but that's the practical reality in which we live. So grahya means objective. So the first level of the objective objects are the objects that are created by the 5 elements. And as we have seen before, and we'll look at again, there is a chart that Babaji made that shows a meditator meditating on an apple. So if we took that chart and looked at it, we would see that the apple is an object that exists outside of our mental awareness, in which our mind becomes absorbed in this process of concentration. So the object of concentration could be an apple, but it also could be the syllable Om, for example. In any case, the initial object of concentration involves a word denoting the object. Apple could also be manzana or same, depending on the language used. But those words are used to indicate the object. So our initial concentration will involve the word that indicates the object. It will involve the object itself, the energetic essence, the presence of that physical object. And it will also involve the knowledge about that object. The apple then is a fruit that's edible, that has a sweet and sour taste to it. We know about the object apple. So all of those associative knowledges or information comes into our mind when we're focused on the apple. So the name, the presence of the apple, and the associative knowledge all come into our mind as we focus on the objective phenomena. Now, if we apply this to the syllable Om, the Om is the word, is the vibrational essence that indicates, as we discussed earlier in this Samadhi pod, Ishvara, God as creator, the energy of creation itself. And then we further might bring into our mind the aspects of Ishvara. And we could even infer that it's referring to Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer, and that was actually embodied in the sound of Om. So all of that associative knowledge is involved in our concentration on Om. And actually, that's the prescription that was given in terms of the way, the method of Ishvara Pranidhan, or surrender to God, Tajapastarartha Bhavanam. The japa of Om, the repeating of the name, and the bhavanam, the consideration of all the aspects of Om, the associative knowledge, and then Om itself may reveal to us that ever new pranav energy that's within each moment, within each transformation, that's within us and everything around us. And our mind may become absorbed in that essence of the object. So the same process will happen no matter which object we choose. We talk about choosing a spiritual object. That should be an object in which we can invest our faith, that represents our internal aspiration for release from the bondage of our self-created suffering, that represents the divine to us. However we might conceive of that object, it should bring out our internal aim towards liberation, towards peace, towards enlightenment and understanding. So it is in this progression of the samapattis. It starts with an existing object in which our mind becomes concentrated. The second level of the grahya, or objective, is the subtle, the energetic essence within the object. This is corresponding to the savichara level of samadhi, in which time, space, and causation are the fluctuation of the mind as it enters the subtle consideration of the object. Now, on the subtle level, each object is entirely unique in its transformation in the moment. So apples might look similar, might even look identical, but each apple exists within its own transformation and is totally unique. That uniqueness of the transformation is known in the subtle absorption of time, space, and causation relative to the object. So it's still an objective phenomenon, but the words denoting the object and the knowledge associated with the object are now transcended, and the mind is resting in the energetic essence of the object itself. This is the second level of grahya. The third level of this absorption, that's called samapatti, is on grahana, the instruments of cognition. So actually, the ego self, the individuality, is our instrument of cognition. And we go through life in our experience and our liberation from experience. That's the purpose of the incarnation. That's the purpose of Prakriti, to give us those possibilities. Those are all transformations within our individuality. So this level of absorption follows the objective. Mind continues to internalize and now is considering the instruments of cognition, the mind and senses, and the ego which owns that experience. This is a transition into sananda and ultimately sasmita samadhi, which is a state of grahitri, the subject alone. So eventually the subject, the internal being, the universal self, that's not only within us but is within all of the whole creation, the self itself becomes the object of samapatti, and grahitri samapatti. And this concludes the levels of the objects in which the mind can be absorbed in the levels of samprajñata samadhi, or samadhi accompanied by wisdom, by knowledge, which leads to the transcendence of our own self-created suffering.
So for Sutra 42, we'll just read the English translation. The engrossment in which there is imaginary cognition of word, its meaning, the object signified, and its knowledge is called the Vitarka accompanied samapatti. And Dayanand spoke about this already. So just to review, because this is the most accessible and first initial stage of samadhi, savitarka is with reasoning. It's when the distractions are limited to the object itself. So the mind is absorbed in the object, not distracted by anything else, but the mind's movement is between the name or sound, the knowledge or meaning, and form or essence. He gave 2 examples, and in the chart that Babaji made, you can see the apple as the object, and sometimes we speak of Om as the object. Regardless, whatever the sacred object is, the mind is revolving amongst only those 3. And it said that the elements may be in the vitarka, or the organs of perception, the gyanendriyas, may be in the vitarka, or the mind, manas, or the karmendriyas, the organs of action. If the mind suspends even the revolution between name, form, and meaning, and becomes absorbed in the essence or form alone, that's called Nirvitarka. The reasoning is suspended, and the form alone shines in the mind, shines in the transparent crystal of the mind. Babaji would say that meditators come to have savitarka samadhi and may not recognize it because the mind is not yet one-pointed. The thoughts are not yet suspended, but the thoughts are limited to only those three aspects of the object. And then in Nirvitarka, the reasoning is briefly suspended for the duration of the samadhi. We'll go on to Sutra 43, which is a key sutra, and we'll chant it.
Sutra 43. Smriti parishuddhau swarupa shunye varta matra nirbhasa nirvitarka.
When the memory is completely purified, the mind appears to be devoid of its own nature of reflective consciousness, and only the object on which it is contemplating remains illumined. This kind of engrossment is called Nirvitarka samapatti. We started to talk about that in Sutra 42, and Sutra 43 goes into it in detail.
Nirvitarka, the suspension of vitarka. This is a new concept that Patanjali Rishi is giving us at this point of the description of the internalizing mind through the processes of samadhi. Between the different stages of the samprajñata samadhi, there is a suspension, a brief suspension as the mind transits to the more subtle level of concentration. And with the suspension of nirvitarka, the subtle object, which is inferred from the gross object, in other words, any object that exists within our perceptible framework, also has an internal vibrational essence that we can also become absorbed in, because actually we are also objects, we are as subjects, we have those same energies, the energies of the tanmatra, which give us the ability to perceive through our nose, through our eyes, through our skin, through our sensation. We can perceive the objects. There's a subtle resonance of frequency between the objects and our subtle senses. This would be in the savichara level, but from the savitarka to the savichara, there's a brief period of suspension of all mental activity. And the sutra gives us a phrase that's again used when samadhi is defined in Vibhutipad as the eighth limb of Ashtanga Yoga. And that phrase is artha matra nirbhasa. Artha, or the essence of the object in which the mind is absorbed. Matra, the indicator of that essence. We are absorbed in the indicator of the essence of the object as it is shining forth in the mind, nirbhasa. Indicator of the essence of the object shining in the mind. The mind is no longer considering any ideation, is no longer interrupted by any considerations about the object or even the words denoting the object is absorbed in the object such that the object alone, the essence of that object, the indicator of the essence of the object is shining in the mind. This is Nirvitarka samadhi. And again is the transition to the next subtler level, savichara.
So what I'll add, because this can seem overly complex, if we look at the sutra again, when the memory is completely purified. So we're aware in our daily life how we don't see things afresh and in each moment as their own individual essence. We take it in and bring the past into the present. We bring the future into the present. This says when the memory is completely purified, meaning when the mind is simply looking at the essence of the object. The mind appears to be devoid of its own nature of reflective consciousness. We could say the mind stops thinking. Our regular nature of our mind is to take in the sensory input and have all kinds of thoughts and feelings about that sensory input. At this moment, it appears to be devoid of all of that. Indeed, when the memory is purified, we're absolutely present and absorbed, the mind is devoid of what we normally think it is. Only the object upon which it is contemplating remains illumined. Only the essence of that object shines forth in the mind.
In Sutra 44, Patanjali then makes a parallel between this savitarka and nirvitarka and the next stages of the samadhi absorption.
So to read Sutra 44, savichara and nirvichara samadhis, in which the object is subtle, are also explained by the foregoing or the preceding. So this sutra is simply stating that this next, more subtle level of absorption of the mind, we can understand it the same way we understood what was just explained. So in vitarka, savitarka, we move from the sound, the form, and the meanings to only the form. The mind gets more subtle, the absorption gets more deep. And now the mind is going to move to reflect on the subtlety of the object, even more subtle than just the essence. And then again, once it's absorbed only in the reflection, it will become more subtle again and move to nirvichara. So these four sutras explain through the image of the transparent crystal and the purifying of mind and memory, the way that the mind becomes more subtle in its absorption of the object, has greater clarity. The crystal is becoming more transparent. The object that is shining forth in the mind is more subtle.
In Sutra 45, Patanjali takes this principle to its ultimate extent. The sutra reads, Sukshma Visayatvam Chalinga Vasanam, or the state of samadhi concerned with subtle objects extends up to Prakriti, the source of all manifestation. So Patanjali is now expressing the essence of a seamless, subtle transition from the suspension of the consideration of the subtle object all the way through to the very source of manifestation. So in terms of those levels of samapatti that he introduced in Sutra 41, now he's including the whole level of grahitri, and grahana, the instrumental and the subjective levels of samapatti within the perfection of nirvichara, the suspension of the considerations of the subtlety of the object as external to the mind, as external to our experience. Now we're entering into a level of samadhi or absorption in which all things are coming together in manifestation in the same moment. And we're entering into that true moment of being that is universal, that is infinite, that is undivided, that is omniscient and omnipresent. This is the level of consideration of the samadhi, the absorption, going up to the very source of manifestation, the Prakriti, the manifesting principle itself. So this is the extent of the samadhis with knowledge. And in 46, then Patanjali Rishi is classifying all of these samadhis described through this process of samapatti as Sabija samadhi, samadhi with seed. 46. Ta eva sabijaha samadhihi.
Those 4 samadhis explained before are the samadhis with seed. So just to recap, as we said, 41, the transparent crystal of the mind was introduced with its objects of concentration in 3 levels, called samapatti. So the absorption of the mind called samapatti. Then Savitarka was explained, Nirvitarka was explained, Savichar and Nirvichar were known to be explained in the same way. And then comes in the focus on Prakriti itself. And now a turn saying that everything that was explained are samadhis with seed. The seed is the support, the object, and all of the samadhis that were discussed have a support, an object, whether it's a grosser object, where we're absorbed in name, form, and meaning, or it's the subtlest of the subtle objects, as Dayanand was saying, the universality of being. Those are all a support to the mind that's clear as a crystal. Now for 46, it goes on to talk about the seed and the types of seed, etc.
Seed implies essence. In a seed is the whole program of the plant that grows from the seed. So seed also implies potentiality. So in samadhi, the samadhi with seed, there's both an essence in which the mind becomes absorbed, and there is a development from that essence. And in the case of samadhi, the development is knowledge and dispassion. So Babaji was often asked to confirm people's samadhi experiences. And he would generally say or ask them, is there peace? Is there transcendence? Is there knowledge? Is there dispassion? So if the samadhi or the experience is accompanied by those factors, then we could confirm to ourselves that perhaps that is a samadhi experience. If not, we can know that it was some other kind of experience. So those are the telltale signs of the samadhi with knowledge, with seed, Sabija samadhi. It should be having an effect of peace and dispassion.
It's interesting to think of that word knowledge in English, because it might, in English, it means so many different things. I can learn from you, I can learn from a book, I can learn all kinds of facts and different concepts. This is a knowledge that's being spoken about, is a knowledge that arises within and has a surety to it. It's not a learned knowing, it's an arising knowing. And it perhaps is easiest to think of it in terms of a savitarka or nirvitarka. The form of the object is known. It arises in the mind. There's no doubt it's the form. So it's that kind of knowing. The dispassion that's known is a willingness to release other interests, to release distractions, to release desires. Not a becoming not passionate about one's life, but rather having a neutrality towards all that takes the mind away from its concentrated form.
In Sutra 47, it goes on to confirm what Saradaji has just been saying by saying that the perfection of nirvichara gives atma prasadaha, or the blessing of the self. So that inner guru, Babaji would say, the true guru is your own self, is this atma, the indwelling self. We came into contact with that through association with our external guru, but what was awakened was a sense of internal self, the being inside of us all. And this being itself, this atma, this indwelling presence, is what is drawing us in and instructing us in the subtle aspects of the samadhi, the subtle developments that come out of the suspension of vichara, of nirvichara samadhi. And this leads us to a different kind of knowledge. As Sarada was explaining, there's external knowledge. Now this knowledge is defined in Sutra 48, which states, Ritambara tatra prajna.
In that state, the knowledge gains bears the supreme truth.
Ritam means truth, and it's not conceptual truth. There's a saying in yoga, Ritam satyam paramam param. Ritam, the experienced truth, is the conceptual truth that's gone beyond. So the kind of subtle experiences that are available in these internalizing states of the consciousness known as samadhi is an experienced knowledge of truth. It's not a conception, it's not a belief in which we have faith. That also may be important as a factor in our practice, but it's an experienced truth. Ritambara prajna. And the sutras then go on to state how that Ritambara prajna prevents the arisings of other latencies. So this is a great sutra.
448, I'll just add that, again, the imagery is so beautiful. Just that in this state of samapatti, of nirvichara samadhi, where spiritual insight is purified, truth-bearing knowledge dawns. It's a very beautiful image. So for Sutra 49, the translation, truth-bearing wisdom, Ritambhara Pragya, is different in aim from the knowledge derived from testimony or inference because it has a special purpose. It deals with particulars. And the challenging word here will be particulars. Will you say something about what that means?
The subtle essences that are known in the process of samadhi are not like other things that are known, not like external objects. They're not even like the subtlety of our true feelings about things or even the essences of the objects. They're even more particular than that as the mind travels inside through the levels of this engrossment, through the instrumental levels, and then through the absorption in the subjective principle itself. These are ever more specific in terms of the levels of objective phenomena or absorption, or in terms of the level of the samadhi that's involved. So we can't describe it in words or concepts. They refer to it as particulars here. Particulars because this is essence of our experience. And these essences of experience are present always and all of the time and within all experiences. But because our mind and senses are involved in the worldly sense of objects as separate from our subjective reality and as things to manipulate and things that will give us what we want, as things that we remember from the past, all of the variations of our experience, we're not aware of the particulars. Through the process of the purification of mind as indicated in the first sutra of this segment, through the further internalization of mind, through the different levels of samapatti or engrossment described in the preceding sutras, the particulars are known. So,
I think the essential difference is that Ritambhara Pragya is a direct experience, and that's why the sutra says it's different than knowledge from testimony or inference, two other ways that we know things. It's a direct experience, but it's not a direct experience through the senses. It's an inner experience beyond any sense perception. And it's a necessary stage, a necessary step, a necessary state of mind, that the special purpose of Ritambhara Pragya is to know these particulars through the subtlest forms in the mind.
So let's look at the liberating potential of Ritambhara Prajna in Sutra 50. Tajjaha sanskaronya sanskara pratibandhi.
The latent impression produced from that samadhi wisdom is opposed to the formation of other latent impressions. So now we have to go back in our memory, in our learning, to the word samskara. the latent impressions, the prints, the patterns, our way of being, brought forward from the past into the present, constantly printing, making new impressions, constantly influencing our lives, the conditioning of our mind. And Ritambara Pragya prevents any future impressions, any patternings. It interrupts that cycle completely, and therefore is part of the self-liberating process.
And as we know, samadhi also makes sanskara. The concentration, if practiced regularly, leads to deepening concentration. So Babaji always stressed regular practice as a method of deepening our sanskara of practice. And by repetition, it becomes easier. And that muscle of internalizing the consciousness, that ability becomes more ingrained and easier to achieve, and samadhi will then deepen. So all along, even through this process of Ritambara Prajna, a sanskara of knowledge is developing, and dispassion is deepening along with the deepening of that knowledge until the final step, which is described in Sutra 51. Tasyapi nirodhe sarva nirodhan nirbija samadhi.
By the control of even that, the latent impressions of sampragyata samadhi, the control of all else takes place, and thereby seedless samadhi, asampragyata, is attained. So by the control of even the samskara of sampragyata samadhi, the control of everything else happens. And asampragyat samadhi, the samadhi beyond any support, is attained.
This was all foreshadowed in Sutra 2. Yogas citta vritti nirodha. That yoga, union, is the restraint of the thought waves in the mind. And we have discussed, as we've gone through all of this samadhi pad, how this nirodha is both a process that's involved in the initial stages of concentration and in the deepening of concentration through this internalizing process that we've just gone through again in the discussion of samapatti in the end of the samadhi pad of Patanjali Yoga Darshan. And the final sutra, 51, indicates the establishment in nirodha, or the state of nirodha, the completely restrained state of consciousness that transcends even the highest knowledge, the ultimate expression of dispassion, and the key to freeing from this bondage in the cycle of birth and death. So, nirodha, process, nirodha, a state of complete freedom, kaivalya, which will be further explored in the subsequent books. Both the practice and the complete liberation are elucidated in the Patanjali Yoga Darshan.
So that concludes the last sutra of Book 1, and as Dayanand was saying, it ends where it begins. And to conclude our study, we'll chant a concluding mantra.
Iti Patanjali Yoga Sutra Pate Samadhi Padaha Pratamaha